Hello and welcome to the Sense Making in a Changing World podcast. I'm Morag. Join me each week in conversation with leading ecological thinkers, activists, authors, designers and practitioners to explore what now? What is the kind of thinking we need to navigate a positive and regenerative way forward? To myceliate possibilities, to explore what a thriving one planet way of life could look like. My guests offer voices of clarity and common sense. In this episode, I'm speaking with Dr. Ruth Backstrom, author, speaker, coach, acclaimed educator who offers a dynamic facilitation approach to help people address stuck situations and work together, connecting deeper conversations collaboratively towards a positive shift. She's also been a champion for creating a local food policy council. Ruth asks the question, what if, instead of fighting over politics, diverse groups of citizens could come together to envision and create the kind of system they want? And is this even possible? I talk with Ruth too about her new book, Igniting a Bold New Democracy, Empowering Citizens Through Game-Changing Reforms. The Sense Making in a Changing World podcast is a project of the Permaculture Education Institute. We teach permaculture design, teaching and livelihood skills online to people on 6 continents, who in turn localise and enrich it and find appropriate ways to apply the planet care ethics of earth care, people care and fair share wherever they are. I'm recording this episode from my hand-built solar-powered studio here on beautiful Gubbi Gubbi country, surrounded by my permaculture design gardens in a permaculture village. Before we jump in, I'd love to invite you to subscribe to the Sense Making a Changing World podcast on your favourite podcast app. And please do leave us a 5-star review and a lovely comment. It does indeed help the bots to find our show. I hope you enjoy this episode. I'm so excited about this conversation that we're about to have about how change happens and how communities can be engaged in this and how we can reimagine the kind of democracy that we need to take us forward in amidst all the multiple crises that we're faced with. And so maybe we could just begin, like, what ignited you in the first instance to focus on democracy as being that point of change that we need to focus on?
Part of it is that I felt like there wasn't enough attention on that area. Everyone's divided into all these other issues, but this fundamental problem we seem to dance around or something. We can't kind of get our hands around it. But my real passion for writing this book started way back when I was young, actually. I went through a neighborhood, nearby neighborhood. It was an African-American low wealth neighborhood. And I turned to my mother and I said, why don't they have more money? I saw these inequities just as a 7-year-old, just the simple innocence of a 7-year-old. And she didn't have any very satisfying answers for me. It sort of percolated in the back of my mind. And then 5 years later, when I was 13, I heard this voice on the radio, this man who was talking about these issues that I was really deeply concerned with. And I thought, oh, this is great. Someone's finally talking about this stuff. And at the time, I was going to a school that was 90% African American, and it was because we were living in segregated schools. It was overcrowded. It had twice the capacity of a school, so they had these up staircases and down staircases to handle the overflow of the school. So I knew there was something wrong with this from my own personal experience of how this was being navigated. So when I heard there was a civil rights march, I thought, okay, even though I was 13 years old, I thought, I'm really interested in this. I'm really passionate about this. So I went with a friend I lived in Chicago at the time, and we went down to a grassy knoll and we started to sit down on the grassy knoll. As we started to sit down, I noticed across the way that our leader was getting beaten up. And here I was 13, and I'd never seen like a scalp wound before, but he was like, blood pouring down his face and stuff. It was just shocking as a 13-year-old to see that. And so then I got kind of scared, and I sat down with my friend and I sort of interlinked our arms, and I said, hold on tight. And this cop heard me and he went, I'll get that one. He pointed at me. Oh my God. And so I decided, I stood up and I said, I'm walking into the paddy wagons to avoid getting beaten like that. But it left this residue of the power of the civil rights movement and the sacrifices that were made. And yet we didn't make as much progress as I would have liked on those issues. And so that kind of percolated in the back of my mind too. And when the pandemic hit, I started to really try and figure out and research what happened there. How did we renege on those promises? Yeah. And also, what were the other things that started to go wrong in our democracy?
So when you talk about a new democracy, I mean, there's a couple of really big questions that I'd like to ask you around that is, well, what is it that you see that is where our current form of democracy has got stuck, and how has that happened? And how do we begin to imagine together what this new democracy looks like? What is that? So there's two questions.
Yeah, great question. Great question. And I think, one of the things I talk about, I have a blog on my website about, is this idea of partnership democracy, which was really the initial idea. And when it worked well, that's how it worked. The two parties partnered together because they wanted to accomplish big things. The citizens were really active because they wanted to be part of the change and the development too. And then somehow it got very calcified as power got more and more concentrated in the hands of the wealthy. And I traced that whole journey. And I think two of the biggest things is income inequality just became so huge. And while we think of that as maybe a left, in our United States, a left-wing talking point, it's really more than that. It's like you cannot sustain a democracy and have those levels of inequality. No. And there's a huge research study done out of Washington State in 2016 where they collaborated with 14 other universities and looked at inequality over the years. And they saw that the United States is just a real outlier on this, and it's not sustainable. You either get revolution or you get repression. And you can kind of see those forces at play. So something has to shift. And the subtitle of my book is this idea of empowering citizens through game-changing reforms. So what are the reforms that would really take you back to a more vibrant democracy? For the United States, it's getting money out of politics first and foremost. It's just been a huge distraction. I mean, it's such a waste too. It's like flushing money down the toilet or something. It's like, you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't.
As an Australian, it just seems phenomenal. Like, I don't know if I can even quite grasp the amount of money that it takes to be a politician of any standing in your country. I see it heading towards that way here in Australia, and I think a lot of people are really frightened that it will become that, because we're watching now with everything that's going on in America. We're thinking, if we keep following the model, that's kind of where we're heading. So
that's right.
How do we turn this around? How do we reimagine what a different kind of democracy could be? And how do you describe this new form of democracy that you'd like to see happen?
Yeah. So I want to go back to that partnership idea. It's really like, especially partnership between citizens and the government. And interestingly enough, as I was sitting there, it took a pandemic for me to write a book. No distractions.
So I was speaking to someone just the other day, and they said, it was during the pandemic, and I thought I would get to write a book, but all the kids were home. There was so much going on. There was absolutely no way. And it took me until the pandemic finished, or, like we got back out again, that now I've written my book. So well done to you.
But anyway, while I was writing it, I realized all these citizen assemblies started springing up all over the world. And that, to me, is exactly the kind of energy we need. The vision that I had that sort of drove this book is the idea that citizens could take back democracy and create their own agenda instead of trying to shoehorn it into one party or the other. Like, what do we really need to do? And some of the most creative stuff in our country happens on the state level. Like Maine, for instance, started state funding of elections. And they got to the point where 80% of their state representatives were funded locally. And they got the most progressive agenda around the country, really. So it illustrates what you lose when you go to this heavily funded, more concentrated system, more concentrated power and funding stuff.
Yeah. So these citizen assemblies, it's a phenomenal movement, isn't it? That's going on.
Yes.
I heard you mention about them being in partnership with government. How have you seen the different kind of, have you seen different models that have come out? Are there some that are just, independent?
Right, there are. I mean,
or like a government-driven one, or is it always an emergent process from community? How do you?
No, it comes different ways. It's interesting. And actually, as I was writing in my book, I was studying a process in Austria called dynamic facilitation and citizen councils, which is a little smaller than a 20 people instead of 50, which is the citizen assembly size. But I was really intrigued with that because it started in 2005, and then by 2015, it was so successful that it was institutionalized into the state of Bollerberg, Austria, where it was. And so they would call an assembly, a citizens council every year to get the voice of the citizens. And it was really initiated by the administration, actually, in that situation. And it's a non-linear process. It's just having a conversation that kind of unfolds and is captured on charts. And you capture the concerns and you listen really deeply. So the conversation deepens. And it brings out what people talk about as like the collective intelligence of the group. And that's kind of a mouthful, I know. But if you think about an individual working in their zone or at their maximum capacity, well, groups have that capacity too. There's a kind of wisdom of the crowd that can emerge when all the ideas are really woven together in a sort of holistic way. It's an amazing thing to experience. And it's been a really powerful thing in Austria. It's Manfred Hellregel, who's in charge of it, said it's changing the culture.
Yeah.
That the young people want it now. They've had enough of it.
I was wondering, I wanted to ask you about how do they select the people to be part of that? Is it a self-selecting process, or do they have a way of bringing in a full spectrum of young people, old people, diverse?
No, it's a random selection, actually.
Random, yeah.
Yeah. And the idea is that you don't need representation if you're taking people kind of this deeper level of their shared humanity and they're really listening deeply to each other. It's like you're tapping into, I don't know, more subtle realms of a feeling, I guess you would say.
And I wonder whether you've explored what happens after. So if someone's involved in one of these citizen assemblies or citizen councils, when that agency arises, when people get a sense of the possibilities that can happen when we enter into those conversations, what ripples out from that? Have you mapped that?
Yeah, that's a great question. First of all, it's exciting to be part of it because you finally feel like you're contributing as a real citizen instead of as a consumer, is one of the ways that Manfred talks about it. What's the difference between a real citizen and a consumer, And people are really excited. This one gentleman who was in one of them said, "This is the best political conversation I've ever had in my life." And just to give you an example, this was a conversation about immigrants coming into Wolleberg. And it started out and people were kind of shocked by the numbers because they were really high. And they said, and one of the things they said is the government needs to be more transparent about this in the future. And then they got into talking about it and what they should do. And someone said, we have to see the people behind these numbers, though.
Yeah.
Which stirred everyone's sense of compassion. Mm-hmm. And then one gentleman said, well, I don't think we should give these people jobs, which kind of shocked everybody. But in dynamic facilitation, which is a technique by Jim Ruff, by the way, from the United States in Seattle, he says, you listen to everyone and ask what's underneath, so you really get down to where's that question or answer or solution coming from. And he said, well, my niece has been looking for a job for 2 years and she can't find a job. Why should we give immigrants these jobs? And they said, well, what if we opened it up to everyone so your niece could come too? And that was that's sort of the way it works. You weave in everyone's concerns like that. And so that's what they did. Actually, the end result was they created these world cafes. So after the small group meets, they go to a larger group, like 50 people, and they tell them their story, sort of the journey of their conversation. And then they get input from them and they kind of flesh out more of the details. In fact, in Wolleberg, they've got this down to a nice system so that it actually gets implemented. They go through, the stage of talking to this small group, and then it goes through these iterations of having larger groups come together. And in the end, what they did was they created these world cafes for job creation around the state. So that this was in response to the immigrants coming.
So when you're talking about these amazing conversations being hosted in the community, there was a couple of questions that raised in my mind as you were saying that. One is, who chooses the topic that is talked about, or do the topics emerge? And the other question was around, is there someone who's paid to hold and invite and be the catalyst for these conversations? Is there funding for that, or is that driven from within the community, just as like, this is what we need and this is how we'll make it happen?
There is funding for it. Manfred works in this Office of Civic Engagement, so that's actually his job.
Wow, great.
So, yeah, I know.
Gosh, everyone needs it.
I know. Well, we have jobs like that, but they don't often have someone like that doing this sort of level of civic engagement. It's more staged, or we're going to make an appearance and pretend to be interested in what they're going to say.
Yeah, we'll consult with them and see which boxes they tick of our agenda.
Right. And but actually what happens in Boulderberg is they have a legislative body and then this Office of Future Related Activities. And what they want is they want the voice of the people in on this particular topic. And so that's what spurs it on. And then they added a third thing, which is if the citizens want something and they can get enough signatures, the state will pay for it. Oh. So in some ways, it's I think a really great model, and it's less expensive than the larger model of being 50 people. Like that's $30,000 versus $10,000. So it's 3 times as much money. For these more complex things, that might be more appropriate. I mean, for something like climate change. And there's also this issue of like reputability. Like if you have a large crowd, does that give it more credibility? But if you're doing these locally in a small town, this is perfect. Yeah.
So tell me, that's a brilliant example coming out of Austria. Where else have you seen this, and where have you been studying the emergence of these assemblies or wisdom?
Yeah, I haven't really seen any. I've just heard about them. I mean, actually, Melbourne is one of the most interesting.
Yes, it is, isn't it?
In fact, if you have any extra tidbits, I mean, this is something the United States would love. I mean, one of the big complaints is that everybody's overspending and there's no cap on spending. The idea that government even open their books to the public is shocking,
Yeah, they're amazing. They're a phenomenal council. I'm just so impressed with it. I grew up in Melbourne, and I feel really, there's a kind of like a bit of a pride in your hometown kind of things, like, wow, they're so progressive in so many things that they do. And I think it's an amazing model for the world. There's a lot of things that they don't do well, but there's particularly on this, it's great. Yeah. There was a big connection as well with having the declaration of climate emergency. And, that was a big driver, I think, in saying, we need to change. We need to be engaged with everyone to change this. And so I think bringing that bigger picture and engaging people in that bigger picture, like, why is it that we want to change? Like, what's the point of putting our effort and our energy into bringing this forward and changing the status quo? Like, we know that things are a bit crusty, but like, why should we put this much energy? And it needs that perspective. And so I wonder too whether that's what you're noticing when you're looking at these different groups. Like, it's that, what are the triggers that activate people to say, yeah, I'll get involved in this?
People are hungry for this. They are dying for this. The description I read of Melbourne was that there was a woman in labor who was giving her advice over the phone.
Oh, that's hilarious.
Someone else who said, I can only come for a day because I'm on vacation, gave up his vacation. It's like, I think we underestimate the desire that people have to really be part of it. And what we're discovering is it's not a battle between, it's not a choice between democracy and autocracy. It's that we need more democracy, real democracy.
Yeah. Yeah.
This is really giving people a taste of real democracy.
Yeah. So you talk a lot about the role that facilitation plays in this. Do you want to talk a bit more about that? How, when we do get people together in the room, how do we create those spaces where they don't end up in polarized battles of opinion, but in generative spaces where new ideas and that collective intelligence can unfold? How do you?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it has to do with kind of the safety that you create so that everyone can really be heard and understood, and that you're seeking to really understand them too. And I've heard this described in a number of different ways, actually. There's a woman who wrote a book called Conversational Intelligence, Judith Glaser. And she did this in companies. And it was amazing that when she got everyone safe and really talking about their different views of a situation, mapping their different realities together, she could change the whole culture of the organization, and she could change their bottom line. They could make way more money because they really understood the reality much more deeply. So this idea of collective intelligence is a real concrete thing, even though it seems kind of abstract. It's this level. I think I gave a talk and somebody said, I think this is the next level of our evolution. I said, yeah, I do too. It's like learning to really work effectively in groups and to collaborate in this level that's really intelligent, and it works for everybody.
Yeah. So how do you make people feel safe in a room? Like what do you do when you?
Yeah, well, there's a couple things. One thing is it's really important to really listen and to go deeply to understand them. Like the gentleman who said, I don't think the immigrants deserve jobs. Like he went in there with the intention that he was going to say something like that and then get verbally slapped and walk out. Like that was his plan.
I know. Yeah, like you can think of every kind of single group meeting you've been to. You can picture that person. There's
Exactly.
always one. Yeah, but how? Yeah, that's important information and perspective that they bring. That if
exactly, and that's what
you just flick them off, you end up with something that is not a solution, because you're always going to be, ignoring these other voices that can bring so much solution possibilities that address so many other things. So yeah, how to make sure that they feel like they can contribute, and that warmth is extended to the kind of the prickliness that you can feel.
Yes, that's right. And the conversation deepens because of that. It takes it to a deeper level. And I think of it kind of like weaving. You're weaving all these threads together into a tapestry, and you just can't leave any threads out, because society is really enriched by all this. In fact, one of the things I say in my book is that our diversity is our greatest asset. It's not a liability. Yeah. It allows us to problem solve so much more effectively and stuff.
Yeah. And there's something that I wanted to ask you too about engaging women more in reshaping democracy. Sometimes it feels like the whole political system is dominated by, this patriarchal way of being, and you have to kind of become more like them to be able to get into the system. How can we engage women more to reframe how democracy happens?
It's interesting you said that, because I thought, what about bringing together women to do like a citizens council? Wouldn't that be a powerful thing to do? I've been thinking that lately. Really get to these deep conversations. I mean, it's especially important in the United States because there's such a sense of repressed right now. Yeah. So that's on my mind, is how could we do that? That's a great question. And also I think that these international conversations are great too, because there's so much wisdom from one country to another. In the process of taking a seminar in DF, we had this really great international conversation where people were talking about how do you resolve your past, And we had somebody from Germany and somebody from England, and we were all talking about the challenges that around that issue from different perspectives. And it was really interesting because we could learn from each other about that sort of thing in a really, interesting way.
I wonder, are these kind of conversations happening in the communities that you grew up in as a 13-year-old? And what would it look like in those kind of communities? Like, how does it not just become something for more, white privileged people to be having these conversations? How are we really making sure that these sorts of reimaginings of a new democracy is not just still of a small group? How are you noticing that?
Right now, most of the conversations have been around climate change. We haven't done as much as in this realm as other places have. Like, how do we get these sort of marginalized voices more into the mainstream? I think women would be a great way to do that. I mean, I was thinking lately about the idea of bringing African American women, white women together and having conversations. How can we support each other in this tough time?
Yeah. Your background is in facilitation. Is that right?
I actually have a PhD in education.
Oh, you have a PhD. All right. Well, let's talk about facilitation and education then, and what kind of education is needed in order to understand that even a change is necessary, one, and how to bring about the kind of understanding around different forms of facilitation. Like, how do you cultivate courageous leaders who have the capacity to do this kind of work? Like, where is the edge of this that you can kind of grab a hold of and start to, usher it along a bit further?
And so I have a chapter in my book actually called The Learning Society. And I think that's what we have to become. We have to change so much right now. We have to redesign so many systems. And once you change one, there's this cascading of you have to change another and another. And so many of them are broken anyways, particularly in the United States, that they need to be changed. But it's like we really have to get better at learning and learning from the lessons of the past, so we don't pull the same sort of orientation into the future. I was listening to a climate conversation this afternoon on the radio, and this guy was talking about there's some proposals of engineering around climate change and stuff, and everybody's going, well, now that's a really dangerous idea. We don't really know the consequences. And isn't that using the same sort of model that we had in the past, that we can just engineer our way out of everything? And it hasn't worked so well. It's like, how do we really shift? And a lot of it is an emotional kind of intelligence, right? It's coming sort of more aligned with kind of those natural impulses in ourselves, to empathy with the earth and all those sort of things that permaculture talks about, right?
Yeah. And I think you're right. And it's often those things that have been dismissed and in looking for a way forward. It's like the softer, the warmer, that safe space, looking for an answer, where there's no one answer, is there? It's just this kind of woven thread of possibilities that communities can bring together when they feel it, like they feel connected to a place or to a community or to an issue. Like you as a 13-year-old, you kind of brace to say, I really care about this. This means something to me, and I will step up as a courageous leader in whatever way that looks like. And so I think really valuing our emotional responses to things is enormous. And perhaps that's something to do with why it is important to bring women more into this conversation. And
absolutely. I have a chapter, actually, Women Rising Up. It's a really necessary thing right now, is to really bring that voice of compassion, understanding on a deep level. Yeah, absolutely. Our system is stuck. We have these possibilities of this, and these are happening. It's not like, they're going to happen. They are happening, and they're myceliating around the world. What are some of the ways that you think we all can encourage this to happen more in our communities? How might I be able to activate this? So I'm not a minister for civic engagement or the officer for civic engagement. I'm in my community. What can I do? I think that citizens can have a really important role in this, especially you've kind of broken the ice there with Melbourne, It's like, there's all these topics that we could be doing citizens assemblies on, or even dynamic facilitation, or citizens council. So you could start small with that. I mean, one of the things I think that Manfred was really good at is he kind of created a whole ecosystem to support it. Mm-hmm. So that's the thing that really has to happen in communities. You have to start by just learning and creating a supportive system for these new things to take off. Like they started in rural districts, so if they made mistakes, it didn't spread, and they refined it. They realized over time that if they followed the program, followed the steps, it was reliable every time. And so that's the thing you have to do, is really create a system that works. A thing that really intrigued me was when I talked to him, I was saying, well, isn't that great that you're having an influence on government that way? And he said, the most important thing is the learning in the room.
Yeah.
which was really interesting to me because I hadn't really thought of that piece, where there's a tendency of, oh, great, citizens are changing things, but there is this other piece, which is it's going to change when we change.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. And it really feels that it's a shift in understanding about where the power is. So if we think of like, okay, we're going to feed in to this, pointy bit at the end, top of the hierarchy, and gradually our voices will be heard and they'll somehow trickle into that, and then the change will happen. It's like, no, actually, when we engage, things are changing right now because of our engagement. That is the change.
Right.
And every interaction that we have with one another is part of that changing process. And every time we then take, I might go this afternoon to meet someone and say, oh, I just had this great conversation with Ruth, blah, blah, blah. And then that changed. And then someone will say, oh, Morag was just telling me about this conversation she had. And, it just keeps going. You don't know where it's going to end up. But it is that what I describe as this process of myceliation. It's just kind of, you add compost onto this living system that is our community. If you feed it and nourish it and support it, these dynamic conversations spread, and that's kind of where the power lies, I think. And I've really sort of flipped my understanding about how change happens because of that. So citizen assemblies kind of somehow sit, I see, in the middle of this. It's like it's a way to bring the wisdom of this community network at the same time as helping to shift public policy, or there's a sort of an interplay, and it's a really beautiful dynamic place to be in. And I think often there's the gap. Often people are either in the community sector or they're in the government sector, and this is a really beautiful way to kind of, it's kind of it's not glue because you don't want them to stick, but it's like what's a liquid that is like fluid and can move and allow things to
Cornstarch, right? That stuff that
maybe.
Yeah, I think that's true. And one of the things I suggest actually in my book is the idea of learning hubs. Like, we really ought to be talking about what kind of future do we want? What is it going to look like? How, like, we're going to have these amazing technological breakthroughs, but we have to share them. We have to create a more equitable system right now so that when they come, we don't repeat the same pattern of only certain people get to take advantage of them. Yeah. And so we need to be talking about work. Work as we know it is going to disappear. It's not going to be a wage-based system. What do we want? We still need to take care of everybody. And I feel like the more people are involved in those conversations, the less anxiety there's going to be around all of this change. So, I mean, one of my proposals for the United States is to create like 6 learning hubs all around the country where we engage in civic education. Like, I think there's education, and then there's also relational stuff that goes on too. I mean, a lot of the stuff that's going on in the Citizen Council is sort of, can we share power? Will you listen to our advice? I mean, it's really horrible if these people get together and work really hard and then their advice is just ignored. That's the kind of thing that would discourage it. I mean, one of the most interesting things was in Poland, where they said one of the conditions of starting these is that you're going to take our advice if 80% of the people agree on it. So that's kind of the trajectory I see these going on, is that they're going to get to a place. And I know in Ireland, they're so excited about them that I think they're going to become institutionalized at some point because they've been so successful. Yeah. I mean, the trick is to get them right, I guess, because otherwise they can have a hard start.
Yeah. So, how are communities learning about how these assemblies and groups happen? I mean, where is the clearinghouse for that? So that what's being learned in one community, and not to be cookie cutter, but like, here's the lessons from this one. This is how this one works. And so you can, when you start, you can have a look at what's going on in Austria, what's going on in Ireland, what's going on in Australia. Yeah. What's going on.
Well, there's a co-intelligence institute started by Tama Attlee, who really has done a lot of work on this collective intelligence issue. And then Jim Ruff, of course, is in Washington State. So those two links are trying to collect it. And then these guys who have done these assemblies are on they're touring, telling everyone, helping people. So there are people out there.
Yeah, great. How do they do they run, and how do people?
Well, I think of them as civic.
I was going to say the first thing when you were describing it, I was imagining, really localized learning hubs. And every neighborhood creates like a learning hub as a way. And then when you said, 6 of them, I was thinking, oh, well, you've got this myceliating network of hubs that connect in with these, maybe a bi-regional type of learning hub that connects in with, government levels. And I just really bring it down into where people are at, that they can walk to their local learning hub to explore the issues that are going on.
Yeah, that's a great idea.
In my mind.
Well, that's a great idea. I mean, and in Denmark, they have these folk schools, which have been very successful at kind of spreading interest on climate change. So I was talking to this one woman from Copenhagen, and she said, the neighborhoods compete to see who can get their carbon footprint the lowest.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. We're still fighting over, at the time, we were still fighting over whether climate change was really existed.
Yeah, that's right. I know, it's different, isn't it?
Yeah.
So local learning hubs, I think, are really important. I mean, that's where permaculture, I think, really fits into this conversation, because there are local learning hubs. It could be community garden, a school garden. I live here in an eco village. It's a learning hub. It's a place where people can come and learn about different ways of governance too. For example, we have 640 acres that we look after together with 250 people, and a collective dairy, and a co-op bank, and all these different things. And there's examples of how it lands, how these ideas actually land on the ground and become real, and how to keep the conversation going. What I'm finding, this place has been here for 30 years, and somehow it's like there was the visioning, and then it's the actioning, and it feels like we need a new wave of visioning the future, because the pioneers are now quite elderly, but there's a lot of new people moving in, understanding that this new vision of how to live together, how to work together in this sort of localized community. So that's where my mind went to.
Yeah, that's great. Though that's a great way to go too. I mean,
but I'm really keen too, like, how do you amplify the local conversations? Just earlier, I was in a conversation with Pat Kane, and he was talking about how you do need these local projects, but you need a media that is able to amplify the voice, so that whatever it is that you're doing in these local communities, it could be a citizen assembly, it could be an eco-village, it could be what it is that you're doing, but how do you have this alternative media, or this sort of global media, that shares out those solutions in a way that makes sense to people and can be picked up, instead of the kind of media that we have now? So how do you see the amplification of this work? There's people going around doing road shows.
Well, I don't know. When I was thinking about these learning hubs, I was thinking they would communicate with each other clearly and set up their own network in a way.
Nice.
That is a problem. That's where citizens could be really helpful too. Actually, I think citizens have to start magnifying the voices of what's working and spread that. And in a way, citizens assemblies. I mean, I think the citizens assemblies is just the tip of the iceberg of what citizens could be doing now. Like we could be designing the future that we want. I mean, really sitting down and saying, and especially you've got a great situation there, because you're living it in a way. And you could say, these are the steps we need to,
what are the skills that you need? What are the steps? And so that kind of brings me back into the the education side of things. What are the kinds of education that we need to be sharing throughout our communities that will give people at least the basic set of tools to be able to engage more fully in this reimagining of the future? So I think
that's a great question. I think one thing that's really important is sort of more emotional intelligence, and we're doing that a lot in the schools. There is a growing awareness of that. My daughter-in-law telling the story of how this little boy said to his mother, "Now you need to go sit in the red chair because you need to cool down. You're angry now." Then you could go and sit, and after a few minutes, you could sit in the green chair or whatever. And it was clear that he was learning how to kind of deregulate himself in school, and he was bringing it home. I have a good friend who used to say, with her kids, she'd go, "Mommy needs a timeout now."
Yeah, my daughter would say, "Do you need a hug, Mummy?"
Aw.
It was so sweet because I remember when she was really young, and I must have been a bit, upset about something, and she was looking a bit afraid, I think. And I said, "Oh, I'm really sorry, darling. I'm just worried about a few things. I think the best thing that helped this now is like if I just have a hug." And so she took that on for ever more.
Aw.
And oh gosh, that's beautiful because it just dissipates anything once
It's
that
true.
hug comes in.
It's
Oh my
true.
gosh.
It's true.
Yeah.
The power of empathy and stuff.
Oh, absolutely. So I know that in your career of engagement in communities, you have at different times been involved in a number of different projects. And I read somewhere that you're involved in a food policy council. And I wonder whether you could just reflect a bit on what happened in those, how that worked, and how perhaps it could change if it had a different kind of approach of rippling out even further with the
Yeah.
citizens.
Yeah. Our food system's so broken.
Mm.
Yeah. So this was a number of years ago, and we had a transition group actually in my town, and we were trying to create resilience, figure out how to create more resilience. And so we tried to start a food policy. We did start a food policy council, and the issues were very diverse, and the vision of what the food policy council would be were very diverse too. And my friend who was involved in Transition Town with me was like really interested in, well, how does more people get fed? That was her concern, food security and stuff. And it was really hard to get that idea taken up by the Food Policy Council, which was more like, how do we rearrange the food system, and how do we create new farming practices? I mean, it was a little more of an upscale vision of the Food Policy Council, I guess is the best way to put it, or something. And so she was always disappointed because she's kind of going in there with this idea that she would, and finally she kind of created her own organization. She's an amazing organizer, much better than I ever was. She got to talking to somebody in the county and convinced them to have a county position, that was allocated towards looking at food insecurity issues. I think it was just before the pandemic hit, so it was really useful. Some of these most vulnerable people were then getting some attention.
And I think this is a really good point, that often when a community organization gets started, we think that it's going to be something that can represent all of the needs, and it can't. It just possibly can't. I mean, if you can just identify what it is that is the kind of membrane or boundary of that organization, and
Yeah.
say, okay, well, perhaps there's a whole ecology of different organizations that need to occur that can have a relationship, but not that one has to be the answer to all.
Oh, yeah, that's a really good point.
And then also this conversation too with the local council to be able to, I noticed the same thing happened here in actually in Brisbane. I was involved in setting up city farms and community gardens, and there was nothing around like that when I started. But then by the time a few years along, there were a community garden policy in the council. There's community garden officers, community garden grants. But it does take a committed group to come together to find what that, being, your term, the collective intelligence of the community, saying this is what we want, this is why we want it, this is how it can happen, and this is how we need support to make it happen. And really it's kind of not saying, okay, we hand it to you, government, to deliver this, saying we are delivering this, we are making this happen for our community, but this is kind of how our communities need support, and perhaps this is something that you could create. And in that way, that partnership, that community council partnership, I find absolutely critical. And sometimes I find it's like you get this, the community government, push-pull thing, and saying, well, us and them, and, whereas it's a we. Like, how do we step into the we? And I wonder whether you've seen that happen in these citizen assemblies that you've been tracking about, by having those conversations, in that there is that greater sense of the we rather than the us and the them.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was really true in the Austria work. well, like every society, they had these us and thems, and they were able to get to the deeper pain or trauma or something that people had that didn't allow them to come together.
I think sometimes, that there's only a certain depth that you can go to from a government perspective, but then the rest. And so I think giving trust to the community and giving value to community initiatives like this, because it's where that richness happens. It's the spaces that can hold the deepness to deepening and the relationship building. I think when we acknowledge that, we can really make so much more change. So if you were to advocate for, like a call for action of what you would like people to engage with, or what steps in action to take, what would that be from your perspective?
Coming together in groups where there's diversity is really helpful. Getting so we can talk and not take offense if we don't agree. It's like it's okay to not agree. Like it's okay that you see things differently. I mean, that's going to add to the richness of it. And that's the thing that, I mean, in our country, it's really difficult right now. So that's the real learning curve for us, is to come back. And interesting, I just want to tell a story about this. They did a study called America in One Room in, I think it was 2016. And they went to Dallas, Texas, and they got 500 Americans who were representative of America, basically. And they gathered them for a weekend to talk about 5 different issues. And they had experts telling them things from sort of different perspectives. So they got a range of ideas. And they looked at how they felt about things before and after the weekend. Before the weekend, only 30% said our democracy was going well. And at the end of the weekend, 60% said it was going well. It's really an interesting, fascinating study to show how just talking to those people that you've demonized can be so healing,
Yeah, that's right. It's amazing, isn't it? I think that's a brilliant idea. How can we get more of those sorts of things happening? Like actually bringing to, like, regularly in different areas, maybe it could be on a state level or a bioregional level, just constantly hosting these conversations where we receive more information, we find more possibilities for communicating. And as you were talking about, being able to be in a room with other people that you disagree with, but doing it in a really civil way rather than ending up in a fight. And I think that is, like, how do we support that to grow? How do we create those conversations? Because, this polarization that's happening, not just in America, but we're seeing around the world at the moment, it feels like we're just getting more and more polarized. How do we have these sorts of conversations to bring a sense of peace in our communities, and therefore rippling that out to sort of peace at country level or even broader afield? I think this conversation of peace is so essential now.
Yes, it is. And it's happening in a lot of different ways. There's a group, well, I'll put this in the chat, but there's a group called Braver Angels that's doing some really interesting work on this. They're doing workshops where they bring people together from different perspectives and have them talk. And then they're doing debates. Because one of the things that's happening in our universities is it's become like such a contentious area that people aren't comfortable talking about their differences. One of the aspirations of Braver Angels actually is to have people get comfortable talking about anything. You just should be able to talk about your opinions without being uncomfortable. I mean, that's what college is about, to explore all your ideas and your feelings and stuff. So, I mean, I think there's many different ways you can do this kind of attempt to bring back this civility. Some of it is just restoring norms. And that's kind of the vision that I have, is that citizens could come together and start to restore norms. They could come together in groups and say, these are the norms that we want. We want us to have civil conversations. We're tired. I mean, it's crazy. In the United States, we pay these people money to go fight with each other. It's such a waste. But it's a journey too. I mean, I think we've been through a period that's been really difficult, and we're healing from it, really. And that's the trick, is to come back and heal from it.
Yeah.
So we need to have healing conversations, I think, as well as learning conversations. It's kind of a whole spectrum of conversations, and designing conversations. I think one of the things I talk about is power. We have to learn how citizens can and claim more of their power, which is it's sort of exciting to see in these citizen assemblies where, the legitimacy of the government rests on how many of their recommendations they take from the citizens. It's like, all right, that's how it should have been in the first place.
So just on that legitimacy, then I know there's been a couple of questions from citizen assemblies that I've heard of as they're saying, sometimes we feel like the government is just not hearing us. It's that, they feel like, okay, we can talk amongst ourselves and make our own things happen, but there's not that connective tissue between the government. That the government's doing a thing and they can kind of look and see what the citizen assembly is doing, but not necessarily have to take any notice of them. And this group feeling a little bit jaded by the amount of effort that they put into bringing forward suggestions and recommendations. So I know you've talked about the Austrian example of how they've done it, and that is brilliant. And I think, that's a great model. I wonder whether you've seen other models that have worked to maybe do a bit of weaving or stitching to make that connection happen. Is there anything else that you've noticed?
I think in Austria, they just started it and they didn't have it systematized so that it was implemented all the time. And they realized fairly quickly that, they had to have some silent implementation to be doing this in good faith, because otherwise the citizens feel like, well, what's the point? I think that's a process. It's a process of creating trust, really, like the politicians in Ireland, it sounds like, began to think they've got our back, and that was true. I mean, that story about the immigrants, somebody said that I told in Austria, somebody said no politician have the cover to say that we should take care of all the immigrants like that, So the assemblies, in a way, are giving politicians the cover to do the right thing. Yeah. But it is I think it is kind of a journey that some places are going to be, quicker to take this up than other places. But I feel like that's rippling as places like Poland say, hey, you've got to give them 80%. Any recommendation that has 80%, you've got to do. It's like we start to set these models. And in Ireland, I think they've almost been institutionalized. They've been so acceptable. In fact, I understand that parties kind of fight okay, let's call an assembly if we can't agree.
Oh, that's fantastic. That's amazing. Ruth, where can people find more about your writings? Because you have a blog and you also...
Yes, that's right. I have a blog on my website, ruthbackstrom.com. And then my book, Igniting a Bold Democracy, is coming out March 30th. So you can go on there and have and I'll send you an update when it launches. And there will be an international link so people will have access to it too. Take action. That's my final call, is that think about somebody like Greta Thunberg, who's, 15-year-old. If she can take action under the circumstances she was under and have such a profound effect, you can too. Don't think that if you have a particular personality, you can't do it. I mean, she had Asperger's syndrome. She's a 15-year-old. How much power could she have? It just illustrates that if you just lean into your talents and go for what you want, you can become really powerful. We're not using enough of our power as citizens, I think.
On that message, thank you so much, Ruth, for joining me today. It's been an absolute pleasure being in conversation with you.
Yeah, me too. I really enjoyed it a lot. I loved your questions. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Sense Making the Changing World, a podcast of the Permaculture Education Institute. Check out the show notes below to find the links to Dr. Ruth Backstrom's work and her book. Also, too, this is where you'll find details of all of our permaculture courses, our permaculture YouTube, blog, and free masterclasses and permaculture film clubs. Make sure you signed up too to hear all of the news and updates. And come and join us at the Permaculture Education Institute to learn practical skills for designing and teaching permaculture and making a good livelihood while living a permaculture-inspired, one planet way of life. Take care, everyone. See you soon.